my stepbrother forged medical documents to sabotage my family vacation. But when I uncovered the truth, his entire web of lies collapsed, and he got 5 years in prison for fraud and theft. I'm 23 years old. I'm in medical school. And honestly, I need to get this story off my chest because I still can't believe all of this happened. My brother, well, my stepbrother technically, Derek, basically destroyed our family and ended up in prison. And it all started with a vacation to Cambodia that I didn't even get to take. I know it sounds weird, but let me explain from the beginning because this story is total insanity. My mom married my stepdad when I was like 8 years old, I think, after she divorced my biological dad. He's a doctor, a super successful cardiologist. And from day one, he treated me like I was his own daughter. Derek and I were the same age, literally born 3 months apart, so we grew up together like twin siblings almost. Things were good at first, like any blended family trying to make everything work. But then everything changed when I was 13 and my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. It all happened so fast. Honestly. One day she was fine. The next, she was in chemotherapy, and 6 months later she was gone. It was devastating, obviously. And my stepdad, instead of sending me to live with my biological dad who had basically disappeared from my life, decided to officially adopt me. He told me, "You're my daughter now, and you always will be." And I cried for like a week straight because I felt like at least I had someone who really loved me. We grew up together, Derek and I, and for a long time things were pretty normal. We went to the same school, had pretty much the same friends, did the same activities. My stepdad always treated us equally. There was never any favoritism or anything like that, or at least that's what I thought. He gave us the same amount of money for expenses, the same opportunities, everything. He worked a ton because, well, being a doctor is like that, but he always made time for us, to take us to soccer games or whatever. Derek and I were close, I guess. Although we weren't like super tight. We had our own lives, our own friends. But we got along well at home. We never fought much or anything dramatic. Everything started to change when it was time to apply for college and specifically for medical school. My stepdad is a cardiologist, like I said, and he always encouraged both of us to consider medicine if we were interested. I loved the idea since I was little. Honestly, I spent hours reading about anatomy and rare diseases. It was like my thing. Derek also said he wanted to be a doctor, that he wanted to follow in Dad's footsteps, and we all thought it was great that we were both interested in the same thing. We studied together for the medical school entrance exam, spent entire nights reviewing material, quizzing each other. My stepdad paid for super expensive prep classes for both of us, like the best you could get. When the exam results came, I passed on my first attempt. I don't want to sound conceited, but I got a really good score, in the top 5%, or something like that. I was super excited, obviously, and my stepdad was so proud he was literally crying. Derek, on the other hand, didn't pass. He missed it by like 15 points or something. Not much, but enough that he'd have to take it again. At that moment, I thought he was a little upset. But he told me he was happy for me and that he'd try again next year. That it wasn't a big deal. My stepdad told him not to worry, that many people don't pass on the first attempt, that he was going to support him to study more and make it happen. Derek seemed to have taken it well, but looking back, I guess that's where all the resentment started. Fast forward, like 6 months later, I was in my first year of medical school, and the thing was brutal. I'm not going to lie. Classes were intense. I studied like 12 hours a day, barely slept. Derek was supposedly in college, studying biology or something like that, preparing to take the medicine exam again. My stepdad was super busy with work, but always asked how we were both doing, was always there when we needed him. One day, like in March, I think, he came home super excited and told us he had planned a family vacation to Cambodia for the summer. He said it had been years since he'd taken a real vacation, and that he wanted to spend quality time with us before we were both too busy with our careers. Derek and I were excited. Honestly. We'd never been to Asia, and it sounded amazing. Everything was going well until like 2 weeks before the trip. My stepdad called me to his home office, which was already weird because he never did that unless something serious was happening. He had this super serious and worried face, and at that moment I felt my stomach drop to the floor. He told me he needed to talk to me about the vacation, and I thought, okay, what happened? Did they get canceled or something? But what he said was much worse. He explained that Derek had found some medical reports of mine, reports that I supposedly didn't know existed, that showed I had a dangerous heart condition. He said that apparently I'd had some episodes at the hospital where he works, that doctors there had run tests on me without me knowing, and that, basically, I couldn't fly to remote places because the risk of a heart attack or something like that was too high. I sat there completely in shock. I had never, and I mean never, had any heart problems. I'd never fainted, never had chest pain, nothing. I told my stepdad that, and he looked confused too. He showed me the reports Derek had given him, and they were like official hospital documents, with the logo and everything, with my name, my age, everything correct. They said I'd been admitted 3 times in the last 6 months for severe tachycardia, and that cardiologists recommended I avoid situations of extreme stress, including long plane trips, especially to countries where access to specialized medical care wasn't as good. My stepdad asked me if I remembered going to the hospital at all, and I told him no, that I literally had never set foot in his hospital except to visit him sometimes. But the documents looked so real, so official. My stepdad told me Derek had found them in his office, that he'd gone to look for something and saw them in a file with my name. According to Derek, Dad had been hiding them from me so as not to worry me. My stepdad admitted that lately he'd been so busy that it was possible he'd forgotten something like this, although it seemed super weird to him because he always reviewed my medical files personally and didn't remember seeing any of this. But Derek had been so insistent, so worried about my safety, that my stepdad had decided to take the safe route and cancel my part of the trip. Derek and he would go anyway, but I'd have to stay. He told me he was really sorry, that we'd take another trip when we had more certainty about my condition. I was devastated, obviously. Not just because I was going to miss the vacation, but because supposedly I had this serious heart condition that no one had told me about. I begged my stepdad to run tests on me, to take me to another cardiologist, whatever, but he said there wasn't time before the trip and that he'd already changed the tickets, so only he and Derek would go. He said when they got back, he'd do all the necessary tests and we'd get to the bottom of this. Derek was there when this whole conversation happened, and I remember he looked so worried, so sad for me. He hugged me and told me he was so sorry, that he wished he could change things, but that my health was the most important thing. At that moment I thought, well, at least my brother cares about me, you know? They left for Cambodia and I stayed home feeling miserable. But something didn't add up, honestly. I couldn't stop thinking about those medical reports. I'd never had a single symptom, and my stepdad is a cardiologist. He would have noticed something if I really had a heart problem. Plus, how is it possible that they admitted me to the hospital 3 times and I don't remember it? It doesn't make sense. So I started investigating. I called the hospital where my stepdad works and asked for copies of my medical records. They told me they didn't have any file under my name in the last 5 years except for a routine visit like 2 years ago for a bad cold. No emergency admissions, no cardiac tests, absolutely nothing. That's when I realized something was very, very wrong. Those documents Derek had given Dad were fake. They had to be. But why? Why would Derek forge medical reports to prevent me from going on vacation? It didn't make sense. Unless, I don't know, jealousy? Did he want to spend time alone with Dad? But that was crazy. Like doing something so elaborate just for that. I decided that when they got back, I was going to confront them with the evidence that those documents were fake and that someone had forged them. But then, like 3 days after they left, I was home alone and I thought, you know, what? I'm going to check Derek's room. I know it sounds invasive and it's not something I'd normally do, but I needed to understand what was going on. I went to his room, which he never locked, and started looking. At first, I didn't find anything weird, just clothes and books and normal stuff. But then I found his laptop, which he'd left on his desk, and it was open. It didn't have a password, which was already weird because Derek had always been super private about his stuff. I opened his documents and there it was. In a folder called Draft or something like that, a preliminary version of the fake medical reports. The Word documents with the hospital logo, my name, everything. There were different versions. Like he'd been testing what sounded most convincing. I froze, staring at the screen. My own brother had forged medical documents to get me off the trip. I couldn't believe it. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like someone had punched me in the stomach. But then I kept looking, because if he'd done that, what else was he hiding? And what I found next was much worse. Derek had a diary, a digital diary he kept on his laptop. I started reading it, and basically his whole life was a lie. Turns out Derek wasn't even going to college. He'd dropped out after the first year, like immediately after failing the medicine exam. He'd been lying to my stepdad for 2 years, saying he was going to classes when he was actually doing who knows what. But the worst part, what really shocked me, is that he had a gambling addiction. A serious addiction. In his diary, he wrote about casinos, online, sports betting, poker, everything. He'd lost thousands, literally thousands of dollars. He wrote about loan sharks, dangerous people who were collecting debts from him. He had loans from those shady places that charge you ridiculous interest. He was desperate for money. And then he started writing about me, about how I was Dad's favorite now, how Dad always talked about how proud he was, of me, of my achievements in medicine. He wrote, verbatim, "I need to get her out of the way for a while. I need Dad to see that I matter too. That I also need his attention." That's when I understood everything. The fake documents weren't just to get me off the trip. They were part of this bigger plan of Derek's, to get closer to Dad, to get more money probably, to keep financing his addiction. I sat on the floor of his room and cried. Not just because my brother had betrayed me in this horrible way, but because his whole life was a lie and I hadn't seen anything. Dad hadn't seen anything. Derek had been acting all these years, pretending to be the perfect son while his life was falling apart in secret. I took pictures of everything. The fake documents, diary pages, everything. I knew that when Dad and Derek got back, I was going to need evidence. The 2 longest weeks of my life passed. I couldn't talk to Dad because he was in Cambodia and communication was difficult. We only exchanged some basic messages like, "How are you? Everything's fine here." I didn't want to ruin his vacation with this, but I also couldn't wait for him to arrive. When they finally got home, Derek looked so happy, so relaxed. Dad too. They hugged me and told me about the trip, showed me pictures. Derek acted completely normal, like nothing had happened. I waited until that night when the 3 of us were having dinner. I told Dad I needed to talk to him about the medical reports, that I'd done some investigating. Derek turned pale immediately. I literally saw the blood drain from his face. I told Dad I'd called the hospital and that there were no records of those admissions I supposedly had. I showed him the emails from the medical records department confirming it. Dad looked confused, looking at Derek, then at me. Then I pulled out the photos of the draft documents I found on Derek's laptop. The silence at that table was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Derek couldn't look me in the eye. Dad asked him, "Derek, what is this?" And Derek tried to deny it at first. Said I'd invaded his privacy, that I had no right to go through his stuff. But Dad wasn't stupid. He asked him directly, "Did you forge those medical documents?" And Derek finally broke. He started crying and admitted that yes, he'd done it because he was jealous, because he felt like Dad only cared about me since I got into medical school, that he needed to spend time alone with him to reconnect. Dad was devastated. You could see it on his face. But then I asked Derek about college, about the classes he was supposedly taking. And that's when Derek realized I knew much more than just about the fake documents. He went quiet and Dad asked, "What's going on with college?" I told him Derek hadn't been to class in 2 years, that he'd dropped out. Dad asked him if it was true, and Derek just nodded, still crying. Then I mentioned the gambling, the addiction, the debts. Derek got up from the table and yelled that I had no right to look into his private life, that I was nosy, that this was between him and Dad, but Dad was too shocked to say anything. Derek grabbed his keys and ran out of the house. He just left. Dad tried calling him like 1,000 times, but Derek wouldn't answer. That night was horrible. Dad couldn't believe all this had been happening under his nose. He blamed himself, said he should have noticed something, that he'd been too focused on work. I tried to comfort him, but honestly, I was devastated too. Derek was my brother. We'd grown up together. And now that whole relationship felt like a lie. Derek didn't come back that night, or the next. Later we found out he'd stayed with his aunt, his biological mom's sister, who lives like an hour away from us. Dad tried to contact him through her, but Derek didn't want to talk. The aunt called like a week later, hysterical, saying Derek had robbed her. She had a box in her house with emergency money, like $3,000, and Derek had found it and taken everything. He just disappeared in the middle of the night taking the money. The aunt was devastated because that was her fund for medical emergencies. Things got worse. Derek's grandparents, my stepdad's parents, live in another state, and Derek had gone to see them. He told them a whole made-up story about how Dad was going to disinherit Derek and give everything to me. That Dad favored me because I was an adopted daughter, and he wanted to erase all connection to his first wife. The grandparents, who are elderly and a bit gullible honestly, believed everything. Derek even showed them fake documents, supposedly a will from Dad, where everything went to me. He convinced them that Dad was being manipulated by me, that I was the villain of the story. The grandparents gave him a check for $50,000, so Derek could start his own life, away from this toxic family. Derek cashed the check and disappeared again. When the grandparents finally called Dad to confront him about the supposed will, everything came to light. Dad explained to them that there was no such will, that it was all lies, that Derek had a gambling addiction and had been stealing and lying. The grandparents felt horrible, completely betrayed by their own grandson. They tried to cancel the check, but it was too late. Derek had already cashed it. Dad was destroyed. His own son, the boy he'd raised, was basically robbing the whole family, manipulating everyone, making up elaborate lies. Dad made a Facebook post, which he never does because he barely uses social media, warning the whole extended family about Derek, telling them not to believe anything he said, that he had serious problems, and that he might try to manipulate them too. It was super sad to read that post because you could feel Dad's pain in every word. Eventually, we went to the police. We filed a complaint for theft, fraud, forgery of documents. The aunt also filed her own complaint. The grandparents did the same. The police started looking for Derek, but he'd become a ghost. Nobody knew where he was. Like 2 months passed without hearing anything from him. Then, one day we got a call from the police. They'd arrested Derek trying to rob a house. Not just any house, but a house in a super nice neighborhood, where he'd been watching houses to see which ones were empty. They caught him trying to force open a window. They arrested him for attempted robbery, but released him after a few hours because the homeowner decided not to press charges. I don't know why. Maybe he felt sorry for him or something. But Derek already had our complaints hanging over him. A month later, they arrested him again. This time for fraud, theft, and identity theft. All the things he'd done to the family. There was a trial, and it was so sad to be there. The aunt testified about the stolen money, the grandparents about the $50,000 fraud, Dad about the fake medical documents. Derek looked so small and lost sitting there with his public defender. He tried to explain his gambling addiction, how it had started in high school with small bets and had gotten out of control. He talked about the pressure of being the son of a successful doctor, of feeling inferior after failing the medicine exam. It was devastating to hear, but you also couldn't ignore all the damage he'd caused. They found him guilty on all charges. The judge gave him 5 years in prison. 5 years. When they announced the sentence, Derek turned to look at Dad, and they both looked so broken. Dad was crying. I was crying. The grandparents were crying. It was one of the saddest things I've witnessed in my life. Dad went to visit him in prison like a month later. They talked for hours, according to what he told me. Derek explained everything to him. How the addiction had started. How he'd felt when I passed the exam and he didn't. How every day he sank deeper into the lies until he just couldn't see a way out. He said he knew what he did was wrong, that he'd hurt the only people who really loved him. Dad told him he still loved him, that he was his son, and nothing would change that, but that he needed to face the consequences of his actions. 6 months after they sentenced him, I received a letter from Derek from prison. It was long, like 4 pages. He apologized for everything, specifically for the fake medical documents, for trying to sabotage my vacation, for being so jealous and bitter. He said he'd started therapy in prison, that he was going to gambling addicts groups, that he was trying to be better. He didn't expect me to forgive him, he said. But he wanted me to know he was truly sorry, that I never did anything wrong, and that he had projected his own insecurities onto me. I cried reading that letter. Not because I felt bad for him, but because this whole situation was so tragic and so unnecessary. If Derek had asked for help from the beginning, I've been honest about his addiction, about his problems, maybe none of this would have happened. Dad would have done anything to help him. Me too. But he chose the path of deception and manipulation, and now he's paying the price. Last week, I went to visit him in prison for the first time. I hadn't wanted to go before because honestly, I was still processing everything, It still hurt, but I decided I needed to close this chapter somehow. We sat in that horrible visiting room with all the other families and talked. He looked different, thinner, older. He told me again he was sorry, that every day he regretted what he did. I asked him what he was going to do when he got out, and he told me he didn't know, that he had 3.5 more years ahead before even thinking about that. I told him that when he got out, if he really stayed clean and did the work on himself, I'd be willing to give him another chance. Not to go back to how things were before. That's never going to happen, but at least to have some kind of relationship. I told him I could help him get resources for education, that he could take online classes or something while he was inside. He looked at me like he couldn't believe I was saying that and just nodded. I don't know what's going to happen. Derek has a long road ahead, and frankly, I don't know if he's really going to change or if this is just another act. Dad still visits him every month, says he's his son no matter what. I'm still angry. It still hurts. But I also understand that addiction is a disease and that Derek was sick. That doesn't excuse what he did. Definitely not. But at least it explains part of it. I'm in my 3rd year of medical school now, working harder than ever, and I try not to think much about all this. But sometimes at night, when everything's quiet, I think about that vacation to Cambodia I never took, about those fake medical documents, and about how one small lie turned into this massive nightmare that destroyed our whole family. I guess that's what addiction does. And pride, and the inability to ask for help. It destroys everything around it.